There's a specific silence that follows a discard, the one he engineered himself, the one he walked away from, convinced he was in complete control of, convinced the story would unfold exactly the way it always has before. And for a while, in his own mind, it does. He's fine. Better than fine, actually. Relieved even, free of whatever demands or disappointments finally pushed him to end things. This is the story he tells himself, and for a surprising amount of time, he genuinely believes it. Today we're going inside that mind, tracing exactly what actually happens after a narcissist discards someone, moving past the performance he shows the world and into the considerably more complicated, considerably less flattering internal process that unfolds underneath it. Understanding this sequence matters, not because it should change anything about how you move forward, but because it dismantles one of the most persistent, most painful assumptions people carry after being discarded. The assumption that his apparent ease means the relationship and everything you gave it simply didn't matter. Let's start with what a discard actually represents in a narcissist's internal framework, because understanding this foundation explains everything that follows. A discard is rarely, despite how it's often framed in the moment, a genuine, considered decision that the relationship has run its course. It's much more often a response to a specific trigger, a dwindling of supply, a partner who's started setting boundaries, someone who's begun seeing through the performance clearly enough that maintaining it has become more effortful than it's worth. The discard functions as a solution to this discomfort, a way of regaining control by being the one who leaves rather than risking the more threatening possibility of being left. This means the discard, from its very first moment, is built on a foundation of avoidance rather than genuine resolution. He's not processing the relationship's actual ending. He's escaping the specific discomfort that made continuing to invest in it feel costly. This distinction matters enormously because it explains why the apparent ease he displays immediately afterward is considerably more fragile than it appears, resting on avoidance rather than anything resembling genuine peace. In the immediate aftermath, the dominant internal experience is usually something closer to relief mixed with a kind of narrative construction project. He's actively building the story that will let him feel justified, the version of events where you were unreasonable, difficult, ultimately not worth the effort he was investing. This isn't necessarily conscious deception in the way it might look from outside. It's closer to the same defensive architecture we've discussed throughout many previous conversations. The psychological necessity of maintaining an idealized self-image that simply cannot tolerate full acknowledgement of having caused harm without some protective reframing attached to it. This narrative construction serves an important function during this early period. It allows him to redirect his attention outward relatively quickly, often toward whatever alternative source of validation happens to be available. Remember what we discussed in a previous conversation about supply diversification, the way narcissistic psychology, faced with a genuine void, tends to seek rapid replacement rather than sustained reflection. This isn't evidence that the previous relationship didn't matter. It's evidence of exactly the opposite. A system in genuine crisis, urgently seeking whatever alternative can most quickly fill the discomfort your absence has started to create, even while the surface narrative insists everything is fine. Here's where the actual complexity begins, though, because the story he's telling himself and the world rarely holds up perfectly against what's actually happening beneath it. In the days and weeks following the discard, something we might call comparison anxiety typically starts to develop, quietly underneath the confident exterior. This happens as he begins interacting with new people, new potential sources of supply, and finds himself, often without fully realizing it, measuring them against you. This comparison isn't romantic longing in the way you might hope to imagine it. It's closer to a kind of unconscious benchmarking because you set a specific standard for what he could extract from a relationship. Your attentiveness, your compassion, your willingness to interpret his behavior generously, your capacity to provide exactly the kind of regulation and validation his own psychological structure depends on. New people, especially in the early stages of a new connection, haven't yet been trained into this same pattern, haven't yet developed the specific responsiveness you developed over months or years of being in relationship with him. This creates a genuinely frustrating experience for him, though he rarely identifies its actual source accurately. New connections feel, in some hard to articulate way, less satisfying, less stabilizing, requiring more effort to produce the same effect you provided almost automatically by the end of your relationship. He typically attributes this dissatisfaction to the new person's inadequacy rather than recognizing what's actually happening. He's comparing an untrained source of supply against one that took considerable time to develop and finding the comparison genuinely, if confusingly, unfavorable. This is the first crack in the confident narrative, and it usually surfaces well before anything resembling genuine grief or reflection does. It doesn't look like missing you specifically. It looks like irritation with new people, a vague sense that something is harder than it should be, a restlessness that he typically resolves by simply moving on to yet another potential source, rather than examining why the pattern keeps repeating. This deeper process typically begins with what we might call selective memory intrusion, specific moments from the relationship that resurface unbidden at inconvenient times, carrying an emotional weight he doesn't consciously choose to engage with but can't quite manage to suppress either. This isn't the comprehensive nostalgia of someone genuinely grieving a relationship. It's fragmentary, often triggered by unrelated circumstances, and it typically involves very specific kinds of memories. Moments where he felt genuinely, uncomplicatedly cared for, moments where your attention or affection produced a stability he hasn't managed to replicate since. Here's what's important to understand about why these specific memories intrude rather than others, because it reveals something crucial about what he's actually mourning versus what he tells himself and others he's mourning. He's rarely replaying your specific personality, your particular sense of humor, the unique qualities that made you distinctly, irreplaceably you. He's replaying the function you served, the feeling of being understood, the relief of not having to perform quite as hard, the specific quality of your attention when things were going well. This distinction matters enormously, and we discussed it at length in a previous conversation, but it's worth returning to here because it explains why his eventual reflection, however genuine the discomfort feels to him, rarely produces insight about you as an individual person deserving of specific, particular grief. As these memory intrusions accumulate, something shifts in how he begins interpreting his current experience, though this shift happens slowly and remains largely unconscious throughout most of this process. The comparison anxiety we discussed earlier starts merging with this selective memory intrusion, producing a growing, uncomfortable sense that something significant was lost, even while his conscious narrative continues insisting the discard was the right decision, that you weren't actually worth the trouble you supposedly caused. This internal contradiction, conscious narrative insisting relief and justification, unconscious experience producing increasing discomfort and comparison, is precisely what makes this period so psychologically confusing for him, and it's also precisely why his behavior during this stage often looks genuinely erratic to anyone observing from outside. He might oscillate between periods of apparent confidence and thriving, genuine investment in new pursuits or relationships, and periods of unexplained irritability, restlessness, or uncharacteristic behavior that seems to have no clear external trigger. This oscillation reflects the actual internal battle occurring beneath the surface, between the narrative he needs to maintain and the reality his unconscious mind keeps surfacing despite his best efforts to suppress it. Here's where something genuinely significant begins to happen, particularly if you've maintained the kind of complete, sustained absence we discussed extensively in our conversation about what happens when you stay gone. Without your continued presence available to eventually resolve this internal tension through your predictable return, the tension itself starts accumulating rather than dissipating. Remember what we established about how his predictive model depends on eventual resolution through your pursuit or return. When this resolution never arrives, the growing gap between his narrative and his actual internal experience has nowhere productive to go, which means it typically manifests as increasing internal distress rather than gradually fading the way it might if a natural resolution eventually occurred. This is usually the period where genuine psychological crisis, the kind we examined in detail in our conversation about narcissistic breakdown following permanent loss, begins taking shape. The regulatory collapse, the narrative infrastructure collapse, the predictive competence collapse we discussed extensively in that conversation don't happen immediately after the discard. They happen here in this middle period once the initial confident narrative has been sufficiently undermined by accumulating evidence that his usual patterns simply aren't producing the expected resolution. Here's something crucial to understand about the specific quality of what he's experiencing during this period, something that distinguishes it clearly from genuine grief or genuine remorse, even though it might occasionally look similar from the outside. What he's processing isn't primarily about you as a person he wronged and now recognizes the value of. It's about the loss of a specific function, a specific source of stability and validation that he hasn't managed to successfully replace, combined with a growing, deeply uncomfortable confrontation with his own role in that loss becoming permanent. A confrontation his psychological architecture is doing everything possible to avoid fully processing. This is why, even during periods of apparent genuine distress, his behavior often continues to prioritize narrative management over anything resembling honest self-examination. He might tell mutual friends a version of events that positions his current struggle as evidence of how deeply he loved you, when the more accurate underlying experience is closer to genuine distress at losing access to a stabilizing function he's never developed the capacity to provide for himself. He might perform vulnerability in an attempt to draw you back, not necessarily out of calculated manipulation in every instance, but because genuine internal discomfort combined with the absence of healthier processing tools naturally produces exactly this kind of attempted reconnection as the only strategy his psychological architecture has ever successfully used to resolve this specific kind of distress. This is the period, if it occurs, where the discard's original narrative, the story where he left because you weren't worth the trouble, becomes increasingly difficult to sustain, at least internally, even while it might continue being performed externally for as long as possible. Because here's what genuinely differentiates one narcissist's trajectory from another during this final phase. Not whether internal crisis occurs, since we've traced why it almost inevitably does once sustained absence removes his usual resolution mechanism, but what happens once that crisis reaches its peak and either finds some form of resolution or simply becomes a permanent, unresolved feature of his ongoing psychological landscape. For some, this crisis eventually resolves through exactly what we discussed in our conversation about supply diversification, a new relationship sufficiently intense and sufficiently early in its idealization phase provides enough temporary stabilization that the discomfort we've traced throughout this entire process gets successfully, if only temporarily, managed once again. This resolution doesn't represent genuine growth or genuine processing of what actually happened. It represents successful avoidance The same fundamental strategy that's characterized his entire approach to psychological discomfort throughout his life, simply redirected toward a new source rather than genuinely worked through. For others, particularly when circumstances make this kind of rapid replacement more difficult to achieve, the crisis doesn't resolve so cleanly. Instead, it settles into something more chronic, a persistent low-grade dissatisfaction that follows him into subsequent relationships, an unconscious pattern of comparing every new connection against a benchmark he never fully acknowledges or understands the origin of, a restlessness that never quite resolves into anything he could accurately name or address. This is where we sometimes see the pattern we discussed in our earlier conversation about narcissistic obsession during no contact extend even further into something that outlasts any reasonable time frame, becoming a kind of permanent psychological fixture rather than a temporary crisis eventually resolved through avoidance. Here's what almost never happens, and it's worth stating this directly because it addresses something that likely matters to anyone listening to this entire explanation, hoping it might eventually lead towards some kind of genuine transformation, full, honest reckoning with what actually happened, followed by sustained, authentic change in how he approaches relationships going forward. This isn't impossible in an absolute sense. People do sometimes change, even people with significant narcissistic patterns, but it requires something considerably more demanding than the crisis we've traced throughout this conversation. It requires sustained professional support, genuine willingness to tolerate the exact kind of psychological discomfort his entire defensive architecture was built to avoid, and typically years of consistent effort that has almost nothing to do with any single relationship's ending, however significant that relationship's discard turns out to be in his own internal experience. This matters enormously for how you interpret everything we've discussed today, because it's easy, having traced this entire internal process in such detail, to start hoping that understanding it means something different might eventually emerge from it. Understanding his internal crisis doesn't mean waiting for it to produce genuine accountability, because in most cases, it simply doesn't. It resolves one way or another through avoidance, through supply diversification, through the same fundamental strategies that characterized his entire approach to psychological discomfort throughout the relationship itself. Here's what actually matters. And it's the same conclusion we've reached throughout many of these conversations, arrived at through a slightly different path this time. What happens inside him after the discard, however genuinely complex, however genuinely uncomfortable it might become for him, was never actually something your healing needed to depend on understanding. You don't need him to reach genuine crisis in order to know what you experienced was real. You don't need his eventual comparison anxiety, his selective memory intrusion, his internal contradiction between narrative and reality to validate anything about your own worth or your own decision to build a life beyond whatever role you once occupied in his psychological stability. If you're currently in the position of wondering what's actually happening inside him after discarding you, understand that whatever process he's moving through, whether it resolves quickly through replacement or settles into something more chronic and unresolved, belongs entirely to his own psychological architecture, one that was already shaped, already limited, already operating according to patterns established long before you ever entered his life. You were never actually the cause of these limitations, and you're not required to witness, track, or wait around for whatever resolution his internal process eventually reaches, if it reaches any resolution at all. What actually matters is what you do with your own attention now that you understand this entire mechanism clearly. Because here's the final, most important truth this exploration reveals. Understanding his internal experience in this much detail can easily become another way of staying tethered to him. Another reason to keep checking, keep interpreting, keep wondering whether the crisis we've traced today is currently unfolding on his side of a separation that's already correctly complete. Real freedom doesn't come from becoming an expert in his internal unraveling. It comes from reaching the point where this knowledge, however genuinely fascinating or even validating it might feel, simply stops requiring your ongoing attention at all. You already know what you survived. You already know what you gave, what he took, and what it cost you to finally, completely walk away. Whatever happens inside his mind now, whether it produces genuine reckoning or simply another cycle of avoidance repeated with someone new, was never actually the part of this story that required your continued presence to unfold. That part belongs entirely to him. Your part, the only part that was ever actually yours to write, is simply this: building a life so complete, so genuinely your own, that his internal process, whatever shape it eventually takes,